I am here to talk to you about something really fun that I think a lot of you are going to find interesting, and hopefully the rest of you will at least find it entertaining. And that's I'm going to talk to you about podcasting. Now, specifically, I want to start this off by talking about media as a whole. And what I'd like to argue is that all media, at its core, has the exact same goal and the exact same challenge, and that's to connect with an audience. And what I want to do is start off actually by taking a look at this, not from the standpoint of connecting through story or characters, but on a technical level, this challenge of distance as it relates to media. I'll give you an example. How many of you have seen a movie in the movie theaters? Pretty much all of us. That's exactly right. Of course, in a couple generations, it might be a different response to that question. But I love going to see movies in the movie theater. One of the last ones that I saw was a film, Logan, which was one of the last movies in the X-Men franchise. You know, it was a really great movie, strong characters, strong stories, and did a great job of connecting with me because it went past the distance. And here's what I mean by distance. If you think about, let's say Logan, right? So you got Hugh Jackman, he's on set, and he's doing his Wolverine thing, right? Like schnickety and all that great stuff. And that's happening a distance away from the camera. Now, that camera is the exact same lens through which you see the film, the screen. And when you're in the movie theater, you're sitting a distance away from the screen, much like many of you are sitting a distance away from this screen right here. So from that standpoint, you see what I mean when I talk about the distance between yourself and the audience and the action beyond the camera. Now, television actually brings things in a little bit closer. With television, you know, in the earliest days of sitcoms, it became a tradition, right? The camera took the place of the TV. And a lot of the action that would actually happen on the couch, so that the characters were sitting there on their couch, as presumably you were while you're watching them. Now, vloggers and YouTube have brought this in even closer. Most of these vloggers, what they do is they use the webcam that's right on their computer, right? So they're the exact same distance away from their screen as you are when you're watching them. And you know, it's interesting, because if you think about it from this standpoint, it's almost like they're right across the table. Now, this idea of distance and space as it relates to media is not just about visual. In fact, audio has kind of this same sensation as well. You know, if you're driving down the car and you listen to talk show radio hosts, those voices that you're hearing are existing in a space, the space inside your car. And if you think about it, that's kind of a sacred space, right? Like, you don't just let anybody inside your car. You only let people inside your car that you trust. Now, as I mentioned, we're actually talking about podcasting today. And podcasting in the early days were these talk radio-style broadcasts that you could download and take with you on the iPod. Now, out of curiosity, how many people had one of the original iPods? A couple of you? Not me. I asked Santa Claus every single year for an iPod, and I never got one. My sister did, but that's a conversation between me and my therapist. Look, the iPod was a great device, right? But in the early days, you didn't have speakers built in. It's not like the iPhones or your smartphones today. Back then, if you were going to listen to something on your iPod, you could only listen through your headphones. And actually, that tradition carries on today. The primary way in which people listen to podcasts on their phone or otherwise is specifically on headphones. And if you think about that, that's right up in your ear, where there's no distance between you and the voice that you're hearing. And I would argue that's a pretty intimate space that probably you would not even allow your closest of friends, and yet that's the way that most people are primarily engaging with podcasts. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about what people are actually talking about. Podcasting is seen as, in many respects, as kind of the future of radio. But at the same time, there are differences there and different challenges that exist. For example, if you're driving down the road and you turn on the radio and you hear a sportscaster or a commentator, and they're talking about football, you may stop and listen to what he has to say if you're someone who cares about football. But if he starts talking about some Midwestern conference that you don't really care about, then you're likely to change the channel. So the challenge to broadcasters, to radio, is they have to keep the subject matter very broad. You could even say a mile wide, but only go about an inch deep. But with podcasting, because the listener takes the choice to choose the content they listen to, you can have an entire 2-hour-long conversation dedicated to the Michigan Wolverines every single week. Don't know why there's 2 Wolverines references in this presentation, just the way it turned out. But from that standpoint, If you're talking about only one team for that amount of time, you're only going about an inch wide, but you're going a mile deep. Now, some of you hear that and you think, okay, but who really wants to listen to content about the Michigan Wolverines for 2 hours every single week? But of course, the answer is simple. Someone who cares very passionately about the Michigan Wolverines. So you have this intersection, this subject matter that's being discussed on a very passionate level that the listener and the speaker share in this passion. And it's happening in that most intimate of spaces. And this intersection creates a very powerful connection. And I would even argue, to some extent, a relationship. I noticed it in myself. I've been a fan of podcasting for well over 10 years. And I remember listening, tuning in, finding them, and listening to shows that were dedicated to my favorite television shows, my hobbies, just a subject matter that made me want to be a better person. But while I originally came to them because of the subject matter, I stayed because of the voices that I was hearing. In fact, over time, I felt like I was part of the conversation, even though they couldn't hear me. These people, these voices, were becoming my friends, even though they didn't know I existed. And some of you may hear that and think, that sounds really weird. But I've talked to a lot of people over the last several years, and that's actually a pretty common thing that you see out of people who listen to podcasts. And it's not weird at all. This kind of relationship, this kind of trust, this kind of connection is exactly what businesses are spending millions and billions of dollars to do with their marketing campaigns, to have this kind of relationship with their audience, which of course is their customers and their potential customers. Now, before getting involved with podcasting, my background was in telecom, and specifically in marketing product development, but by way of retail, and I love retail. It's a great way to connect with people, get to know people as they're coming in, find out about what their needs are, so you can kind of figure out if your product is right for them and kind of show them the benefits. But the reality is that people don't shop retail for products anymore. If you're shopping for a product, you're probably going to shop online, right? I mean, it's easier, it's more convenient, it's often cheaper. But if you're shopping retail, what you're really shopping for is experience. So I had this idea. What if you were to take a shop, a retail shop with a ton of really great experience, just a very unique experience from the moment you walk in the door, and you take that shop and you take that experience and put it in the form of a podcast? Give it to your existing customers as a way for them to stay connected with the shop, to learn more about it, to become more brand loyal, more sticky, something that beckons them back in and ultimately buys more products. That was a sales pitch I took to a local business here called the Country Squire. Now, the Country Squire is a mom-and-pop pipe tobacco shop here in Jackson, Mississippi, right down the street on Lakeland Drive. Now, this is a brick-and-mortar, just very, very charming shop, and the then manager, now owner of the shop, loved the idea of this, creating the experience and putting it on a podcast. And what we found is that when we started to think about what we would talk about here, it wasn't just the shop itself, it was the culture that surrounded pipe tobacco, the hand-blended processes, the industry, the carved pipes, that sort of thing. And in fact, we used all of this information and created a show called Country Squire Radio, which within the first 10 episodes did exactly what it was supposed to. Connected with the local audience, gave them a reason to kind of come into the shop and ask more questions about it, talk about it amongst themselves, made them feel more comfortable just engaging with one another because they all had this shared experience outside of the shop. But more than that, we entered into such a niche space that we were exposing pipe enthusiasts all over the world to this little mom-and-pop shop in Jackson, Mississippi. In fact, we started to discover that we actually had an audience in Austin, Texas, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in LA, in New York, in the UK, and Indonesia. And to date, the Country Squire is now shipping product worldwide because of the exposure they've gotten from doing this podcast. And the listeners have gotten very passionately attached. Many have traveled from around the country to come right here to Jackson, Mississippi, just to come to the shop where the show happens. They call this their pipe pilgrimage. And that's actually a term that the listeners have actually come up with themselves. So I tell you that kind of example to show you that podcasting is very powerful. And I don't just talk about it as someone who was really interested, and so we kind of tried this experiment. In fact, Country Squire Radio was one of the first shows that I did as part of my company, Podastery Studios, which started in 2013, and we specialize in best in quality content for the subject matter that we cover. We've attracted guests and experts in all of the fields and areas that we focus, and to date, we enjoy over 100,000 downloads per month. So I understand this from an industry level, and I also understand that podcasting as an industry is growing quickly. In fact, just last week, 35 million people listened to a podcast. And actually, last year, over half the US population knew about podcasting, and that number is getting even higher this year. Edison Research did a breakdown where they took a look and discovered that the average American spends about 4 hours a day listening to audio. And they did something kind of cool with that. They broke it down, right? They saw that the average American, that 4 hours that they listen to, about 54% of that time is spent listening to traditional radio, with 16% being owned music and 15% streamed. Now, that's the average Joe on the street. But for one of those 35 million people that I mentioned, one of the podcast listeners, for them, 32% of that time is spent listening to podcasts, with only 25% of that time listening to radio. And then the rest is about the same. So podcasting is taking a direct kind of chunk out of radio listening. And actually, for those people, I think this is incredible. They spend more time listening to podcasts than they do on Facebook. It's actually kind of scary when you think about how much time we spend on Facebook, but it's actually double that amount of time listening to podcasts for those that listen. And podcasting, it is a really amazing and fun space to be in right now because of the growth. But there's also something of a missing link. If podcasting is the future of radio, I think it's important to focus on what radio has provided for all of us over the years. In the early days, you think about radio, a tower goes up, and suddenly they're broadcasting to this radius in the area. Wherever the waves could reach, people could hear the voice of the people on the radio. But those limitations of the radius in which it could reach was actually something of a benefit, kind of a blessing in disguise. Because that meant that the content that was created was very rich and very focused and tailored to that local community. I think about how, all of these companies exist to create data profiles on who we are. What my extreme interests are, obviously Wolverine is one of them. But beyond that, whatever my interests are may be very different from all of you in here. We could all have very different things that motivate us, that make us want to get up in the morning. But one thing that we all share, the one category that is always relevant to all of us at any given time, is local. What's going on in our local areas? And radio has really been able to provide that historically. But I think that podcasting has the ability to do this as well. It's one of the reasons why we created Satchel, which is a podcast discovery business that we created around finding content that's created in the local area, and raising to the top people who are building content for their local communities. Because if podcasting is powerful, how much more powerful can it be when you apply it locally? I mean, think about it. Country Squire Radio is a great example, but any business that relies heavily on its local customer base, think about sharing the story of struggle, of establishing your business, of competing in a global market, but for the local area. Getting your customers really kind of on your team, on your side, supporting you by buying your products. That's huge. Think about what this could do for local activism. Think about the fact that if you have a way to stay informed about what's going on, the action you can take in your city, how much more powerful that can be. So many of the conversations that are happening in the courtrooms and on the streets, what if those were presented in the form of a podcast where they could be intimately listened to, not just by your supporters, but by your opposition, giving them an ear into closed-door conversations they would not normally ever have. And then, of course, politics and news. Look, this is crucial because, look, I'm a millennial, just barely, but I am. And on top of that, I've got 2 beautiful children, an amazing wife, 2 businesses that I own, and I don't have time to read. I just don't. I also don't watch television by appointment anymore. And radio, I haven't listened to the radio in over 10 years. So how am I staying informed on local events, local news? I mean, sure, we've got Facebook, Twitter, these social media platforms that, push forth the headlines, but again, no time to read. I'm just seeing those headlines. And as we all know, the headlines don't necessarily mean as much as maybe they once did. So what does podcasting have to do in terms of creating content to keep people like me informed? People who can create, or people who consume content on the go. There's a huge opportunity to do this on a local level, where I think it's probably more important than anywhere else to stay informed in what's going on in your city. So hopefully I've been able to share with you a little bit of my experience and how podcasting is very much a powerful platform, how you can use it to connect with an audience, and how there's an amazing opportunity for this to happen on a local level. Thank you very much.